Creation's Journey to Life, Day 64, Willpower. Watch the documentaries The Trap, The Century of the Self, and Psywar for context. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that will is a decision, permission, acceptance, and allowance as a result of the living human nature on earth. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that in most cases of willpower, the abuser will justify abuse as the decision or will of the abused. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that consumerism and the way of influence is based on the right of the consumer to refuse the product. Yet with the willpower of the consumer influence, the profiteer happily transfers responsibility to the consumer, always not with all the information, but with enough to influence the will of the consumer. This subtle brainwash makes all humans thusly influenced, without morals, and not worthy of trust, as the consumers, as product of consumerism, will never act in the interest of life and will in fact see life as a threat to their happiness and happily sell their soul for just a bit of happiness. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to not realize that time exists to test will, and what one will repeatedly will become reality and mold into the substance that is accepted as this world. There is no shortcut but to stop and undo what has been willed breath by breath, and then to will into creation breath by breath that which is best for all life. The abuser will claim the miraculous as if time is not necessary as described, and time will catch up with the last breath and rid life forever from the abuser. Will that be you as well? I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that the will of God is the will of the image and likeness of God, which is the will of man, and not being the will of God as what is best for all life, is to use the will of the image and likeness of God in vain and vanity, and those that will this, it is written, will certainly die. Each will determine the outcome of each life. Will the breath that animated the clay become eternal life or not? Who will decide? I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that the will of a child is broken by the parent when the will of the parent is forced upon the child, when that forced will is not what is best for all life. The parent forces the will of the child always, and thus have the responsibility to force the will to what is best for all life, as only then are all children born secure to have a life that will lead always to happiness, and only then is the will of life to be fulfilled in all ways complete. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that will in all ways that exist is choice, and will that is free is choice without fear, and thus choice without consequence that is polarized in good and bad is the only choice that is free. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that all will on earth now, all choice on earth now, is not free, because it will not lead to a life for each individual that is best, as it is not based on what is best for all, securing what is best for each individual. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that external peace will only be on earth when the individual will is directed to be the will in each individual that is best for all life, and thus security in the trustworthy living will end fear of each other on earth. I commit myself to show that all will is always directive as the outcome of will is measurable, as it accumulates into consequence that is either best for all life, which never happens, or it is not best for all life, which always happens, giving the evidence that the will of man is compromised in a measurable way and is thus able to be corrected. I commit myself to show that all abuse on earth is a matter of deliberate will, and that this deliberateness accumulates through small allowances to eventually look like circumstances, while the outcome was always measurable from the beginning. Advertising that molds will to brand loyalty, for instance, uses the small measures to get the eventual controlled outcome for profit, and in part of the design of individual will utilized to shape the will of man in consumerism. I commit myself to show that the will of the consumer is subtly shaped to the will of profit, with full understanding of the profiteer that is in the intended outcome, and as such, this manipulation of will in a real free society will be a criminal act, which will eventually be realized to bring such criminals to book at last. I commit myself to show that time is the master on earth through which the inner intent of will of each is measured to see who will honor life. I commit myself to show that religion in all forms exists to try and deny the time it takes to shape will, to justify the weakness of will on the nature of man. And through this, abuse is justified, and unscrupulous men become the leaders of men, as what men will inside will be the leader directive will of the world. And only once the individual will of each one is restored to the oneness that is best for all life, shall the world be at peace with what is best for all life. I commit myself to show that the key to a world that will be peace and happiness is the will of the parent, and that the parent does realize this in some measure, but the will of the parent is so compromised with fear that the children will remain the products of fear of the parent till the parent restores their will to life to be worthy of life again. I commit myself to show that no will on earth is free, because even the abuser that shapes the will of others for profit is subject to profit, and just a slave of their own making that will not enter eternal life, just as the abused will not enter eternal life. I commit myself to show that the 7-year Journey to Life blogs and the Destiny Eye process are designed to restore individual will to life, step by step, that will produce the outcome of the will to life and produce a world that is best for all life, and ask those that with the will to hear to start walking to freedom immediately, as postponement only indicates a compromised will.